What would you do if you were walking through the old quarter with your new betrothed on your arm, being congratulated by everyone you passed, and looked across a wet market square and saw the wife you had thrown out 14 months ago standing in a soup queue in a coat with no buttons, 7 months pregnant, and understood in one appalling instant that the child was yours? He stopped walking. That was what the whole street noticed, that Lucan Voss, who had not been surprised by anything in 11 years, stopped dead in a public square, with a woman on his arm, and did not move. And 40 feet away, a thin woman with wet hair and a queue ticket looked back with no expression whatsoever, which was worse than hatred, and turned away and shuffled forward, because she was cold and hungry and had stopped expecting anything from him long ago. This is a story of hidden worth, of a woman destroyed by a lie nobody bothered to examine, and of the ruthless man who discovered far too late exactly what he had thrown away. Anki Keller had been the wife of the most dangerous man in that city for 4 years, and nothing at all for 14 months. And the distance between those two facts was one sheet of paper. She was 30, with a quiet, steady face and ink-stained fingers. She could not scrub clean, and before she was anybody's wife, she had been the person who wrote things down. That was her whole position when she arrived at 22, a scribe of the old kind, employed because Lucan Voss's father believed a family that writes nothing down eventually forgets what it is. She wrote the correspondence, the notes of meetings, the letters that could not be typed or dictated to a stranger. She had a hand that was famous in a small world, a clear, elegant script half the families on that coast could recognize on sight, and she had written in it faithfully for 8 years. And it was her own handwriting that destroyed her. 14 months earlier, a letter had been produced at a family council, addressed to a rival house, describing the movements of Lucan Voss on a night that had very nearly got him killed. And it was written, unmistakably, in the hand of his own wife. Anki looked at that letter across a table with 16 men watching, and said the only thing there was to say, which was that she had not written it. And Lucan Voss looked at the page, then at her, and asked one question, whether she could explain how a letter in her hand had come to be in a rival's house, and she said, no. Nobody asked her anything else. She was out of that house before midnight with a bag and no money. The marriage ended in 11 days by men who did such things quietly, and the world she had lived in for 8 years simply closed over the place where she had been. And nobody in that entire organization had thought to ask the only question that mattered, which Anki had asked herself every day for 14 months. If a woman is going to betray her husband in writing, why on earth would she do it in her own handwriting? Lucan Voss was the reason rooms had temperatures. He was tall and broad and dressed in charcoal cut with lethal precision, the head of a house that owned the river trade, and the fear of every serious family for 100 miles, and he was rumoured to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice, and in the 14 months since he put his wife out he had been, by every visible measure, the same man, and by every invisible one, considerably worse. He did not speak of her. He had her name taken out of the household books. He allowed a betrothal to Sybil, a daughter of an allied family, because a man in his position must be seen to have a future, and felt nothing about it either way, which he privately took as recovery. And then he walked through the old quarter on a wet Tuesday, with Sybil on his arm, and saw a soup queue outside a mission hall, and in it a woman he had loved for 4 years, in a coat with no buttons, hands folded over a belly that could not possibly be explained by 14 months of absence. He did the arithmetic in about a second and a half. He had thrown her out at the beginning of April. What he did next was watched by an entire street. He stood absolutely still, then took Sybil's hand off his arm and set it down, said something brief to her, and crossed that square alone. Anne Kay did not run. She had imagined this moment more times than she would admit, and in every version she said something cutting and dignified. What happened was that he stopped 6 feet away and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither said anything for a long time, and then he said quietly, "Is it mine?" And Anik Keller, 30 years old, 7 months pregnant, in a soup queue in front of 40 people said, "Does it matter?" and turned away. He did not force her. That surprised her most. She had braced for a man who took what he wanted, and instead got a car at the end of her street with a driver who did nothing, a doctor who said she had been asked to come and would leave if unwelcome, and one letter in his own bad blocky hand, saying only that he did not ask her to see him, that a house had been taken in her name and was hers whether she ever spoke to him again or not, and that he had a question and would wait until she was willing. She did not answer for 9 days. On the 10th, she agreed to see him because she was 7 months pregnant and cold and had a child to think about, and because underneath everything was a rage she had carried for 14 months and wanted finally to put down somewhere. He was standing when she came in. He did not offer her anything or begin with a speech. He said, "I never asked you a second question." She stopped. 14 months ago, I asked if you could explain the letter, and you said no, and I did not ask you anything else. That is the entire investigation I conducted into my own wife. He did not look away from her. So I am asking now, tell me about the letter. And Anik Heller, who had waited 14 months for one person in that world to ask a single question, put her hands flat on the table and said, "I have been waiting to say this to somebody who could count." Then she told him what she had understood on the first night alone in a room she had paid for with her wedding ring. "That letter was written in my hand," she said. "Not something like my hand. It had the way I cut the descender on a lowercase g, which I do because my grandmother did, and the way I closed the loop on a D, and whoever made it had studied me a long time." She leaned forward, "Which is the whole point. If I wanted to sell you, I would have used a typewriter, a telephone, a stranger's hand, or no hand at all. There is no version of a woman betraying her husband where she does it in the one handwriting on this coast that everybody can identify. She let that sit. That letter was not evidence that I did it. It was evidence that somebody wanted it to be unmistakably me, and nobody in that room asked why, because it was easier to believe I was stupid than to believe somebody in that house was clever. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and it was not aimed at her. Lucan Voss sat down slowly, which she had never seen him do mid-conversation in 8 years. "Say the rest," he said. "There is more." "There is a great deal more," said Aniki, "because a hand like mine cannot be copied by looking once. It takes months of practice, and practice leaves paper." He came to that house every day after that, and did not once behave like a man who expected to be forgiven. He asked. That was all he did, and it undid her more thoroughly than anything else could have, that a man who had never had to ask for anything now asked for everything, whether he might sit down, whether she wanted him to go, whether he could put his hand where the child was moving. He learned she had been living on almost nothing and was too proud to write to anybody, and had gone on writing every day for herself, because a hand goes stiff if you stop. And she learned he had not slept properly in 14 months and had never once said her name aloud to another human being, and Auntie began, very slowly, to unfold. She started saying the furious things she had stored up, and he took everyone without defending himself, which infuriated her further, and then, gradually, did not. And one evening at the door of the house he had put in her name. His hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and he said, "Tell me to stop." And Ank, who had had 14 months of practice at wanting nothing, said, "I do not know yet." And he said, Then I will wait. Liefste. And left her standing in the hallway with her hand pressed over the child and her heart going like a bird. But Anke, being Anke, had never stopped thinking about practice sheets, and now she had somebody who could get her into a house. The cruelty came at a formal gathering, and it arrived wearing an engagement ring that no longer meant anything. Lucan had ended the betrothal within a week, plainly and without insult, and settled a great deal of money on the family to prevent a war, and Sibylle had taken the settlement and kept the ring and spent every day since telling a version in which she was the injured party. And when Lucan brought Anke to her first gathering in 14 months, 7.5 months pregnant, in a dark green dress with her chin up, Sibylle crossed the room at once, with an audience assembling behind her. "Oh, the scribe," Sibylle said brightly, loud enough for the room. Back from the dead, she let her eyes travel over Anke's belly with theatrical sympathy. And in a condition too, how convenient, she smiled like a blade. "Nobody here has forgotten what you did, sweetheart. He may have decided to be sentimental about a child, and men do, but sentiment is not the same as clearing your name, and every person in this room still knows you sold him. You will always be the woman who wrote that letter." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and the old Anke, the one who had walked out of that house at midnight with a bag, would have absorbed it. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not lower her eyes. "You are right, that everyone here believes I wrote it," Anke said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect clarity. 16 men looked at a page for 4 minutes and decided the rest of my life. "But you have said something interesting, Sibylle. You said, 'I will always be the woman who wrote that letter.' And I have been thinking a great deal this last month about the person who actually did write it and what that would have taken. It takes months to learn a hand like mine, months of sheets, every one wrong, until the last. Nobody burns the early ones, because early ones look like nothing. And I have started asking a very small number of people in this city whether anybody was buying particular ink and particular paper in the winter before I was thrown out. So be careful how confidently you tell that story." Somebody in this room practiced for a year. The silence had teeth. Sibylle went white and left the room. And Lucan, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Annie's hand and pressed his lips to her ink-stained knuckles in front of the entire gathering. "This is my wife," he said to all of them. "And the fact that a room full of you sat and watched me put her out is something I will be correcting for some time. Not in my world, and never in front of me. Liefste." But past Sibylle's shoulder, a man who had stood at the Voss family's right hand for 17 years had gone very still, because he had a box in his cellar that he had been meaning to burn for 14 months and had never quite been able to, because it represented a year of the finest work he had ever done. The man was Rutger, Lucan Voss's consigliere, and he had spent a year learning a woman's hand. He had done it for the most banal reason in the world, which was that he had been selling information to a rival house for 3 years and had begun to feel the net closing, and needed somebody else for it to close on. He chose Anke because she was the most convenient person in that house to destroy, being a woman not born to that world, and the only one whose hand everybody could identify. He bought the correct paper and the correct ink, and sat in a cellar for 11 months with copies of her letters, teaching his hand to be her hand, and when he finally produced a page, he could not tell from hers who used it, and it worked perfectly, and the whole household turned on her inside 4 minutes. And he had kept the practice sheets, because every man who has ever done a thing well keeps the evidence of how well he did it. Rutger had told himself for 14 months that he would burn them, and had not, and now there was a woman back in that house saying, out loud, in front of 40 people, that she was asking about ink. Rutger smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Anke brought it to Lucan that night, and she brought it the way she brought everything, in order and with the calm of a woman who had spent 14 months assembling it in her head, with nothing else to do. She had started from the only fixed point she had. The paper. The forged letter was on a heavy laid paper with a particular watermark which she had seen across that table and never forgotten. And it was not the paper the house used, which meant somebody bought it. 4 suppliers carried it. 2 would not talk. The 3rd had no records that old. And the 4th, a stationer near the cathedral who had known her since she was 22, came out of his back room with an order book showing that in the October and November before she was cast out, somebody had bought that paper 11 times, in small quantities, always cash. He remembered him and had thought it odd, because the man had also bought her ink. Not similar ink. Her ink, an unfashionable iron gall that only 2 people in that city still used, one a 70-year-old calligrapher, and the other standing in his shop asking questions. And the stationer had described the buyer and had said, without being prompted, that he had assumed the gentleman was buying gifts for the lady who wrote so beautifully. And the description was of a man Lucan had eaten breakfast with that morning. She laid it out on the table without drama, the paper, the watermark, the ink, the 11 purchases, the description. And Lucan Voss went very still and then did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask twice. He did not send a man to verify it, and afterward she understood that this was the entire point, that he would never fail to ask her a second question again as long as he lived. He looked at a case built out of paper and ink, assembled by a woman his household had thrown into the street on 4 minutes of evidence, and said quietly, "Rutger, yes," said Anke. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will go for the sheets, and if he burns them, it is your word against 17 years." Neither of them knew Rutger had already gone home to do exactly that. The house went dark at 2:30. Anke was awake because she was 7.5 months pregnant and had not slept properly through a night in months, and the power died and took the lamps and the stair lights with it, and every instinct, 14 months of living alone in a bad quarter, had honed, screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Lucan had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Anke, sitting up in the dark with both hands over the child, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away, and that they had come for her because she was the only person alive who had put paper and ink together. She did not scream, she did not faint, she did not run, because she was 7.5 months pregnant, and running was not available to her. She thought cold and clear, the way she had every night for 14 months in a room with a broken window below. A door came off its latch. And Anke Keller did the thing. No one in that house, friend or enemy, had thought to account for, because they had all forgotten what she was. She was not a fighter and had never pretended to be. She was a scribe. She had spent 8 years being the person who wrote things down, which meant 8 years thinking about where a piece of paper should be kept, and she had done the only useful thing available to a pregnant woman in a dark house, which was that she had done it 4 days earlier. Because when she went to the stationer, she had not simply asked questions. She asked him to write down what he remembered in his own hand and sign and date it. She took that page to a notary, had it copied and lodged, and sent the second copy to a woman in another city she had gone to school with and never once mentioned to anybody in 8 years. It cost most of the money Lucan had put in her account, and she did it before she told him a single word, because 14 months in a bad quarter teaches you that your word is worth nothing and paper is worth everything. So Anke did not look for a hiding place. She went slowly down the back stairs, holding the rail to the room where the wired telephone hung on its own line, and got one message out. Then she sat in a chair in the middle of that dark kitchen, facing the door, hands folded over her child, because she had calculated correctly that the man coming for her did not want her dead. He wanted paper, and that a woman sitting calmly in a chair is far harder to justify killing than a woman found hiding in a cupboard. She heard him come along the passage unhurried. "Anne," said Rutger pleasantly. From the doorway, he put a torch on her, and then, after a moment, lowered it out of her eyes, which she noted, because it told her a great deal. "You are not hiding, no," said Anke. "That is very sensible," he said, and came in and stood at the other end of the table. "I want the stationer's statement. Give it to me, and I will walk out of this house and you will never be troubled again, and you can have your husband and your child and your rehabilitation. Do you know, in 17 years, I never once thought of you as a danger. You wrote things down. That was your entire function. 11 months, I sat in a cellar learning your hand, and it never occurred to me for a single evening that the woman I was practicing had spent her whole life thinking about where a document goes after you write it. And Anne Keller, sitting in a chair in a dark kitchen at 7.5 months pregnant, did the one thing he never expected, because she had never once been the harmless thing he took her for. She smiled. "You still have not understood it," she said. Silence. "You are here for a statement," she said. "There is no statement in this house. There is a notarized copy in a strongbox in this city, and a second that left the country 9 days ago, with a woman whose name is not written anywhere you can reach, and both were lodged before I said one word to my husband. Because I have been thrown out of a house on somebody else's paperwork once already, and I do not intend to be a woman whose word is the only thing between her and the street ever again. She let it settle. And you are not here for the statement, Rutger. You are here because you cannot burn the practice sheets. You kept them," she said. 11 months of the finest forgery anybody on this coast has produced, and you have had 14 months to burn them and have not, because they are the best work you have ever done, and there is nobody you can show them to. You did not come here tonight to silence a witness. You came because you are a proud man who could not destroy his own masterpiece, and you have known for a month it was going to end you." Rutger said nothing at all, which was the closest thing to a concession she would ever get, and in that silence the gates below came inward, with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Lucan had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Noise erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute, and Rutger turned toward it, and Anke did not move from her chair, because moving had never been the point, and because she had waited 14 months for somebody in that house to arrive in time. The kitchen filled with torchlight, and Lucan came through soaked to the skin, his eyes wild and searching, and Bram, his loyal second, came behind him with a crowd of men, and the trap Rutger had spent 3 years building closed around him instead. Lucan had him against the wall by the throat before he could speak. 17 years, he said, and his voice was almost gentle, which was the most frightening thing anybody in that room had heard. "You sat at my table and let me put my wife into the street in April." Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Rutger to Bram's men and crossed to the chair in 2 strides and went down on his knees in front of it. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands moving over her arms, her face, and then shaking. "To the child. Both of you, look at me, breathe, tell me, we are fine," Anke said. I did not get up. He wanted paper, not a corpse, and I was not going to waddle away from a man in a corridor at my size and give him a reason. And Lucan Voss made a sound into her lap that was not quite a laugh, and stayed on his knees, and said into the fabric of her dress, "I asked you one question in April." "One." And Annika put her ink-stained hand on the back of his head and said, "You asked the second one in the end." Rutger, who had smiled at the Voss family for 17 years while learning another woman's hand, learned the price of underestimating her before the week was out. They found the practice sheets in a cellar in a locked case. 11 months of them, hundreds of pages, and laid them on the long table before the same 16 men who had judged Annik Keller in 4 minutes 14 months earlier and made them look for considerably longer. Lucan did not act in blind rage. He let Anki speak in her own voice, without notes, about the descender on a lowercase g, the order book, iron gall ink, and the question none of them had asked. And when it was done, and the rival house that had paid Rutger for 3 years was exposed with him, Anke did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. Rutger was stripped of everything and cast out alive, and what followed him for the rest of his life was not the treason, but the vanity of it. Because the story went round every family on that coast within a month, and it was always the same, that Rutger, who was so careful, was undone because he could not bring himself to burn his own handwriting practice. He was not destroyed. He was simply, permanently, a joke, and the old man agreed that was considerably worse. And Sybil, who had said Anke would always be the woman who wrote that letter, found herself at a great many tables where the story of the practice sheets was told with enormous enjoyment, and spent a long season explaining that she had only repeated what everyone believed. And afterward, watched from the far end of every room, Aniki now sat at the center of collects. As for the 16 men who had watched a woman be put out on 4 minutes of evidence, everyone came in the following year to say something to her, and Aniki listened and forgave some, and did not forgive others, and never pretended otherwise. 2 months later, she had a daughter. And a year after that, on a bright morning, washed gold with new sun, Anki Keller stood at a writing desk in a room with tall windows, a child asleep in a basket beside her, and the household books of the entire Voss family open in front of her, because she had gone back to being the person who writes things down on one condition, stated once and never revisited, that nothing in that house would ever again be decided in 4 minutes. Lucan came in and stopped, simply to watch her work. "You are staring," she said, without looking up. "I will never stop," he said, crossing to her. "Do you know what I understood in that square?" he said quietly. "It was not the child." He put his hand flat on the desk beside her page. "It was that you looked at me with no expression at all, and I realized I had done something to you that went all the way through and had done it in an afternoon, without asking." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her ink-stained knuckles. "Everybody in my house looked at your handwriting and saw a confession, Liefste. Not one wondered why a clever woman would sign her own betrayal." Anke looked up at the man the whole city feared, who bowed to no one, and yet knelt entirely to her, and for the first time in years, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent 14 months in a coat with no buttons, condemned by the one thing in the world most completely her own, and she had proven every last one of them wrong, because the thing they used to destroy her, that unmistakable hand, was the very thing proving she could not have done it, and because nobody had ever bothered to ask. He had walked past a soup queue on a wet Tuesday with another woman on his arm, and by the time his enemy understood what she was, the wife he had thrown into the street had taken 17 years of betrayal apart with an order book and a bottle of unfashionable ink. If Annika and Lucan's story of hidden worth, hard-won vindication, and a question asked far too late moved you, if something turned over in you when she said no one had ever asked her a second question, Then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this with someone who has been judged in 4 minutes by people who never asked. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us what was your favorite moment in Anke and Lucan's story.